video on. All right. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Rachel Brown, and I am the program manager for the Atlanta University Center Art History and Curatorial Studies Collective. So our program prepares undergraduate students for careers in the visual arts. We are housed within the Department of Art and Visual Culture at Spelman College. And our program aims to shape the future of the art world by positioning the Atlanta University Center as a leading producer of African-American professionals in these fields. So Clark Atlanta University, Morehouse College, and Spelman College students may enroll in the program as art history majors, minors, or curatorial studies minors. So today I am delighted to welcome Folasade Ologundudu and Destinee Filmore as our speakers in conversation this morning. So together, these two inspiring women will have a conversation about the intersecting worlds of arts media, advocacy, journalism, and social justice. So I will turn it over to you ladies, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me on the show. Really happy to be here.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. My name is Destinee Filmore. I'm a senior art history student at Spelman College. I'm also a Mellon undergraduate curatorial fellow at the High Museum of Art and the public relations director for the Blue Record podcast, which is Spelman College's official student podcast. And I just wanted to briefly introduce myself and invite Sade to do the same.
Thank you so much. So my name is Folasade Ologundudu, and I'm currently a New York City-based artist, multidisciplinary artist, writer, and podcast host and creator. I've been working in this field very recently, but my background is in marketing and communications. And I recently, before COVID, made a switch to start working on my own projects and launching my own platform, my own creative platform. And so that's where I am today with my work. And I'm delighted to be here.
Yes, we're so delighted to have you, and that's a really excellent place to be. And so to preface this is a conversation between Sade and I, and I'm really curious to know more about who you are as a person, as an artist, as a professional, and also how you arrived here today at this practice that you're at. You mentioned that you've began some new projects, and so I'd also really love to hear about those too.
Yes, absolutely. I'd be happy to share some of the stories of how I got here. As far as my background, I grew up in New York, in Brooklyn, and I lived in a very multicultural, racially diverse, ethnically diverse neighborhood. And I think that when I look back on my life and I think about where I am today, so much of that multicultural upbringing really shaped the way I see the world, and really shaped the way I think about collaborative work, about partnerships, about connecting with other people. So that's very paramount to the work that I do. Right now, my podcast is exploring artists and creators of the African diaspora specifically, but moving forward, I really want to work with people from all over the world, from different ethnic groups, from different backgrounds, because I feel like change comes when we really work together. It can't come when we isolate ourselves, especially along racial lines. I think that's part of the problem that we have now on a much larger scale. So that's a little bit tidbit of that. But as far as more into my professional and my educational background, as mentioned, I went to school for marketing. I went to school at Brooklyn College in New York City. And I also studied at FIT at the Fashion Institute of Technology. And in that process of studying and then doing a few internships, working with other brands, from fashion brands to jewelry brands, I loved working on projects, and that was something I was always very interested in. But I got to a place where I really just wanted to work for myself, and I felt that stepping out on my own would be the best way for me to share my own talents with the world and become better at that. If you know.
Yeah, could we pause there? Actually, do you mind talking more about how you arrived at this moment where you decided to work for yourself as opposed to working for other folks?
Yes. So that came about after years of working for other people and feeling like I was excited about the work that I was doing, but I felt like I could always do more, and I always wanted to do more, but I wasn't given that environment or that position where I could do more. And I thought, I have great ideas. Every time I come up with new things and I talk to the people I work with about them, they think that they're great ideas, but maybe there's a little bit of competitiveness. Maybe there's a little bit of jealousy within the workplace, which is something that really does happen. And it really exists on a big level. And I think often if you are a woman of color in a space that's mostly white, you are in some sense, you're an outsider, right? You're one of few. There's no one else like you in a room. And so sometimes your voice isn't heard as much. Sometimes you aren't appreciated as much. And I got to a place where I just wanted to be more appreciated for what I could bring to the table. So the transition came after much frustration and sort of this it was the situation was tense. It was tense because I wasn't enjoying what I was doing anymore. And I wanted to get into a place where I was like, wow, I want to be excited about the work that I do. You know what I mean? I want to be excited about what I'm doing every day. And if I am undervalued or underappreciated, I'm just not going to feel that way. So that emotionally, at least, that was part of how that transition came to life.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a refrain and an experience that I've heard quite frequently, especially from Black women working in really any professional space. And so it's really interesting to hear that that was your experience, and that as opposed to staying there and having to continue to have that experience, you forged a space for yourself. So I'm sorry for interrupting what you were saying. So please continue.
Oh, no. That's quite all right. I just, I found that you do everything right? You go to school, you get the degree, you get out of college, you start the internships, you start working in the professional field. And some people have different trajectories and everyone will have a different experience. But my personal experience was that working for myself always felt like where I was going to end up. And so maybe my bosses and my higher ups could kind of sense that, right? Like they could kind of sense that I was a little bit too independent and a little bit too ambitious to kind of stay within the role that they wanted me in. And I was always ready to break out and try something different. And so now I have complete creative control over how I work, over the kind of people that I connect to, and over the partnerships that I involve myself in. And I really love that. I really love being able to dictate, like, hey, I really like what you do. I want to work with you. And not have someone say, well, we can't do that project right now. Well, okay, no problem, but I'm going to try to do that project. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And so you took a leap and you invested in yourself and your dream.
Yeah, and it wasn't without its challenges. And it's also there were so many months where I was really like, am I doing the right thing? Am I going to be able to make it? Like, how am I going to continue this journey of starting my own business? It's such a risk financially, emotionally. You put so much of yourself into your work. And COVID has just changed the world completely. So, I couldn't have a conversation about where I am right now without talking about COVID, because it's been as much as there's been so much tragedy, there's been so much incredible opportunity during this period. And a lot of the artists and people that I've spoken to and talked to agree, they say the same thing. So it's just interesting to see how out of so much darkness, there can be major moments of inspiration.
Truly, and opportunity to connect. I think that in a lot of programs that I'm involved with, it seems so obvious now that you could just call someone up and have a conversation with somebody, and that you don't have to travel across the country and deal with all these logistical things. It's always been available, this technology, to connect very directly with people all around the world. But I think that this moment has forced us to really lean into that, because it's really the primary means of communicating, especially because of the hindrances on travel, the health risk associated with being in the room with another person person right now. So I definitely see how COVID is just in that way, and also again in very many other ways impacting how I'm experiencing the world too, how I'm connecting with people, how I'm learning new things, and stuff like that. So you were talking then about your time at Brooklyn College and FIT, and this transition to breaking out your young professional, and then you decided that that was a really confining space, perhaps. I'm not sure if would that be accurate, that you were sort of in this confined space and then decided to break out and go into this entrepreneurial venture. Could you talk about the investment that took in yourself, and also some of the risks and rewards that you've experienced? You just mentioned that previously, so I'd really love to hear more about that too.
Yeah, so I mean, as far as financial investments, I just had to make a decision that, I was going to put my finances into my work. And that, it's involved traveling, it's involved just trying to find ways to work with others in a way that isn't super expensive, right? Or that kind of allows me to still maintain the lifestyle that I like and that I'm comfortable with, but also traveling in a different way. So when I started Lightwork and I started my creative platform, I was moving away from I hadn't had an idea to do a podcast until very recently. But late last year, I started traveling and going to Amsterdam in particular. I went to Amsterdam like 2 times last year to connect with some of the artists and the creative people there. And it's a very dynamic and beautiful city that has a lot of diversity. And so I was also accepted into an artist in residency program in Holland for the entire summer. That would have been this summer, 2020, where I would have been exploring my writing, my photography work that I do, and also starting to begin my work in visual arts, which is something that I really want to do. But the trajectory just changed. But I found that working with residencies would be a really great way to help me partially finance some of my projects, right? Because you could stay at a residency and work as an artist and still sort of create projects while you're working. And that was something that I found to be very great for me. And I've also continued to apply to residency programs, recently, things that will come up in 2021. So as far as even just like a tidbit of advice, I would say, if you are an artist or an aspiring curator, residencies have such an impact on how you can pursue your work and kind of help you fund some of those projects. And as far as risk and reward, I think the biggest risk is just the feeling of not having a safety net, right? And that safety net can be the security, usually it's the financial security of your job, right? You're getting a paycheck, but now you're going out on your own and you're like, well, where's that money coming from? How am I funding all of this? And if I'm completely honest, I just said to myself, you know what, Shade, if you're passionate enough, if you work hard enough, and if you continue to push yourself, the money will come. You don't have to make decisions right now based on your finances. So don't do that. If you're lucky enough or privileged enough to be in that position, push yourself to do the hard work and stay passionate about what you want, and let the money be the secondary thing. Don't let it be the first thing in your mind. And I also spoke to a lot of friends and a lot of people in this world and in this industry, and they were like, the minute you create something and now it's really official, you can't go back from that. If you start working from your passion, then you have all of this creativity that you can tap into without being worried about, well, how am I going to pay for this? You know what I mean? So that was definitely a part of my experience. And the rewards have been, I've connected with so many incredible artists. I'm just blown away. As an example, I hadn't left New York since COVID. So now I'm in Miami. You can see this background. And I'm meeting with artists at Fountainhead and Bakehouse. I just went to Rebel Museum yesterday, which was incredible and has such an amazing show. Mm-hmm. So I think I just took the initiative to say, you know what? There's a whole world out here. Let me contact people through Instagram. Let me get in touch with people through social media. Let me explore every single opportunity there is and see what comes back. And that is what I've done. And it's led me to connecting with artists like Renee Cox, connecting with artists and curators and professionals like Janice Bond, who is like the deputy director at the Houston Museum of Art. And it just, all of these things have opened up for me. I had a lunch with Mikhail Solomon, who is the creator and founder of Prism Art Fair in Miami, right? That focused specifically on art of the African diaspora. And these connections just came out of reaching out to people, being open enough to say, and not letting my nervousness, right, which I have, I must admit, not letting my nervousness or any fear take away from what could be on the other side of an opportunity. And sometimes I think my own experience is that fear has stopped me for so many times in my life from doing things. And part of the risk reward, part of the investment in myself, part of that decision making was getting to the place where I said, you know what, fear is no longer going to drive. It's not going to be a force that drives my life. What's going to be a force is like my faith, my belief, my confidence in myself. Those are the things that I'm going to let motivate me. And very important step. And I couldn't have done it without that shift in my perspective. I don't think I would be where I am right now. Even at the very beginning of what is going to be a great career, I wouldn't be there unless I had made that shift,
Yeah, that's such a powerful shift though. And it may, the way that you're speaking about it, it's a really simple, it's a simple idea. It's a very simple answer to the question of how can I move forward? How can I advance myself? But it's also really difficult, I imagine, to actually do that and to make that mental shift happen and to sustain it. Because I feel like fear is a very fearsome enemy, and it's something that may come at random moments, even when you think that you're doing fine, even when you're succeeding and achieving the things that you want to, it has a tendency to pop up again, especially especially once you're near a breakthrough. So I just think it's really fantastic that you shared that. Again, the solution is always easy, but the work is still hard. And that's something that I talk about a lot with colleagues, with friends, and also about this moment, again, this really interesting moment that we are in with the pandemic. I feel like folks are more open to being communicated with than before. I know I would send an email and just not expect a response from a scholar or a curator or an artist. And now in this moment, people are so plugged in digitally because that's truly the primary means of connecting with people even more than before. And folks are responding and being open to helping and communicating and collaborating.
Yeah, and I think that people, if I'm honest, I think people miss each other. They miss human connection. They miss hugging. If you're not doing that with an extended circle, if you have friends and people in your life that are in a different part of a lot of the people that I'm close to don't live where I live. So it allows me to travel a lot, which is one of the things that I love about what I do, but I can't do that right now. You know what I mean? I can't go to the places that I used to go and see the friends that I used to have. And so I think in missing the human connection and in also feeling like, wow, the whole world is experiencing this. I am not alone in what is happening. COVID did that. You could also argue that in a lot of ways, Black Lives Matter did that. There's been this communal, just something is happening in the world that everyone is affected by. And so emails that used to slip through the cracks are not slipping through the cracks anymore, just like you said. And so people who would have been so hard to reach before are now right at they're like right here.
Yeah, literally.
You know what I mean? I'm just like you're a phone call away, you're an email away. And that change has changed the game and really leveled the playing field. I think the interesting part, because I'm someone who's always forward thinking in the sense that sometimes it's hard for me to stay where I am because I'm focused on what I want to do later on.
Yes.
And of course, we all have our things that we need to work on. But because that's how I think, I'm already wondering, so once we get past this, where are we going? You know, like when the pandemic levels out and things start just being somewhat getting back to a new normal, whatever that is going to look like, and you can see people and touch people and go to events again. And that's what I mean. When I say see and touch, I mean, you can have a party, right? And not worry. And like all of your friends can be there. You can host an event. You can do a workshop. You can do a panel discussion in person. All of these things. What is that going to look like? You know, and how has the technology and the digital landscape really changed the way artists, curators, galleries, how is the whole art industry changing because of COVID? It's really fascinating, to be honest.
I was just listening to a conversation that was sponsored, I believe, by the Omari Bearden Foundation, and it was Dr. Mary Schmidt-Campbell, who's the president of Spelman College, in conversation with two artists, one of which is Jordan Castile, and with a curator, I think.
Love Jordan.
Yes, yeah, it was such a wonderful conversation, and I posed that question. I asked, you know, what role does social media specifically play in your practice as an artist? Also, what are you documenting from this moment? How are you commemorating and archiving what's going on now? Because they were having a conversation about the importance of archives as an artist and how archives are used by biographers and curators and scholars to build a narrative about your life once you've gone on. And I've really been thinking about, and even in conversation with archivists at the Smithsonian American Archives, I wondered, you know, how are you documenting tweets? How are you documenting Instagram comments or DMs from people, or the virtual response to things that you're doing? How are you as an artist like archiving? It's just a general question. It's not one that you specifically have to answer, but I think it's very telling of this moment that we're in. People aren't really sending letters anymore. Reviews are digital also, like they're printed in digital publications. And there's this major shift. So this kind of ties into a question that I have posing to you about how your experience with media and or journalism may be sort of how it's impacted your career broadly, but also how you see it kind of playing out in this present moment. What role does media and journalism have in this present moment, and how are you tapping into it?
Can you just repeat the last part?
Yes, what role does journalism and media have in this present moment, especially as an artist and an arts professional, but also how has it impacted your career in general?
Yes. So for me, I found that I was working in marketing and communications and not working as a writer. I did writing in my professional life, but it's only until very recently that I've started doing articles, writing about other artists, doing profiles and interviews for magazines. And I found that I think because of what I'm driven by, which is a sense of wanting to do something that is positive, wanting to educate and inspire others through messaging, through conversation, through discourse, that all of the pitches that I've sent to magazines, all of the things that I'm putting out there in the world are very well received by editors, because not only are we in a place right now specifically that's so tragic, but people need to hear something that's positive. People need to be uplifted. And I think that we are in a place where journalism and media, well, firstly, the industries are changing so much. The digital space is completely taking over the physical 3D world. So newspapers, magazines, I mean, it's interesting to see how some magazines are still working in print, and that's a struggle for them, while others are thriving online in the digital space. I find that for me, magazines are going through a really rough period. Media in general is going through a really rough period. And I also feel like the idea of fake news and being misinformed is very real. And there's a fear that I think there's a fear around what is a credible source? How do you even know if what you're hearing on the news is real anymore? Mm-hmm. And so I think for me, having one-on-one conversations with people is a very important part of news and an important part of journalism. And really just connecting with one person as a source is something that I think is really, really important. I don't know if that fully answers your question, but that's sort of my own experience.
Yeah, no, I certainly think that it does. I feel like millennials, and I guess I'm technically a millennial, but I'm also like a Gen Z. I don't really know, but I feel like this generation of people, these young folks, are kind of credited with the death of media, especially newsprint, which I find to be quite interesting because there's this heavy reliance on like the digital realm and the digital world, but also this desire to connect physically that I think is super present in young folks. And so whether that's like by purchasing things or being around people, but there's like this desire for materiality that does exist. And so I always find it so interesting when again, when we're credited with like the death and the downfall of newspapers specifically and magazines. But then we have instances like the 1619 issue of the New York Times, which I think was very widely collected, sort of as like an object of memorabilia and to commemorate this moment. And I think that it proved that people do indeed like physical things, but the way they're produced must change. So as opposed to, I guess, as opposed to just printing out X amount of magazines and newspapers, that doing pre-orders or responding to the demands of people, because we are quite vocal with what we do like and what we would want, that is the way that a lot of media outlets have to shift. But I don't know if they're going to make that shift or if they're even aware of it because of the people who control them. So that's just a whole other side and a rabbit hole we could certainly go down.
Well, I think what you brought up about earlier as far as archiving is why 3D objects and things that exist in the physical world are so important. When you think about a magazine that you can look at and hold and read 10 or 15 years from now, when you think about a novel or a story or anything that you can sort of reference, you know, what happens if the digital landscape collapses? Anything is possible. And so what happens when the content that you've put online is no longer accessible, if that ever happens? Having that 3D book, having that magazine is so valuable at that point. And I think, you know, I think the technology has affected people in ways in which you're completely unprepared for because it's unprecedented. But for me, I think a lot of people want to go back to basics. They want to go back to what they know and what they recognize. And a book is something you recognize. A magazine is something you know. It is what it is. You call it by its name, you know what it is. Something that you see in the digital world can be obscure. You know, where did this come from? Who wrote it? Who's the person? Where's the connection? If all I have is my computer screen, maybe I feel a loss of connection. Right? And I think media still has the power to change lives and influence people for good. Unfortunately, we live in a world where misinformation is information. And somehow, you know, that becomes the trend, right? That it's the clickbait. It's like, how do we get enough money? How do we stay afloat? What I would love to see as far as projections of the future is like, what does a more sustainable future in media and journalism really look like? Firstly, I mean, are we ever going to get to the place where writers are properly compensated for the work that they do? Like, is that ever going to happen? I mean, the writing industry it's still antiquated. It's still archaic. It's just like the amount of hours that you put into the writing, into the arts is still astronomical in terms of the return. So, you know, I wonder what a more equitable future in journalism and media could look like, coupled with sustainability, especially when you're thinking about not just on the financial side, but in terms of resources and materials and the effect that your production has on an environment, on your community. And I feel like there are some publications out there who are probably wanting to work more in that space, but they're far and few between, at least at the moment.
Yeah, that is just so true. And I'm glad that you used the terms equitable and sustainable as opposed to decolonizing. because and that is due to this larger conversation again that I've been having with colleagues, with classmates, and with other scholars about whether or not systems or institutions or infrastructures can ever truly be decolonized. And it's sort of in this abolitionist strain of thinking that no, not really. And so if we think about the way that these structures were built, the fundamental essence of them, even down to the way that we categorize things, with the way that we name things or people, like that is a fundamental part of a colonial infrastructure. And so it's really difficult to dismantle something like that when our entire world is kind of predicated on its operating this way. So I think about that in the way that it sort of informs media and the art industry specifically, especially in museums, which are very, very, very colonial spaces. And I think that I don't know if decolonialization is ever truly possible, but I do think that making the spaces more equitable and making them possibly more sustainable is more tangible. And that's just, again, another aside. But you mentioned something earlier that I wanted to talk about, and I guess transition to this other topic. You talked about how people want to hear, they want to hear something. They want to hear something positive. And when I thought of that, immediately I thought about the specific value and magic that is podcast making, because you are literally hearing somebody talk, and it feels so intimate to me as an avid podcast listener and a person who works on a podcast. It feels so intimate to hear people having a conversation when I'm playing it in my car or listening in my headphones. It feels like people are speaking around me, and I can engage with them as if, like, you know, on a conversation, like, oh yes, that was so wow, or like, oh my goodness, you know, having really emotive responses as if people were there. And so I've been having and receiving a lot of comfort from listening to podcasts. So I want to know why you decided to begin a podcast, and what power or magic does this medium have that the others that you've experienced don't?
So a little bit of a background story. So last year I had just come back from Amsterdam, and it was November, and I was planting the seeds of the project that I would be doing this summer had COVID not happened at the residency. So once that COVID happened and I realized that I wasn't going to be in Amsterdam, I sort of switched my focus and wanted to work on something else that I was interested in. So I don't know if you know, but I'm sure you do, but the Crown Act was recently passed into legislation in California. The Crown Act says that, right. So last year in
do you mind describing it for our audience?
Oh yeah, yes, of course. So the Crown Act makes it illegal to discriminate against people in the workplace based on their hair. And this law came into being as a response to people of color being told that they couldn't go to school, public school, no less in America, that they were fired from their jobs. A young kid in New Jersey had his dreadlocks cut off while doing a wrestling match. This has all happened within 2018, 2019. And so the Crown Act was then passed in California, the first state, in 2019. Following states have been New York and New Jersey, at least currently, under my assumption. No other states have made this law have enacted this law in their state except these three, which obviously means that it's still legal to discriminate against someone based on their hair. And when I thought about that, I was just mind blown. Like, we're still here in America. We are still here. Even if you think we've made progress, that's not progress. So that was my own feeling. That was my own thinking. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to talk to women of color, and all women actually, as it grew, about their choice to have shaved heads like me. Yes. So I was going to start a podcast about all women who have shaved heads, talk about their struggles, what they go through, what are different ideas of beauty, what does beauty look like, is it changing, is it shifting? This was also a response to a historic moment when 5 beauty pageant winners last year were all women of color. So there was Miss South Africa, there was like Miss Universe, Miss USA, and they were all Black women. That had never happened before. And I thought, okay, what's happening? Are we going through a cultural moment that you know, that it's kind of like, if you're not really looking, you won't see it, you won't notice it. So I say all that to say, the idea of having a podcast and talking to people in this way was something that I was considering months ago, late last year. But what happened to me during COVID was I was sheltering in place, I was home alone, and I was consuming content on my computer online. And I was looking at Tyler Mitchell's Instagram page. We all know Tyler Mitchell, right? Amazing artist and photographer. So I was looking at Tyler Mitchell's Instagram page, and he was putting together his night at the museum. It was his first series of like 24-hour programming of screening films and talks. And one of his talks was with Arthur Jafa. And at that time, I had heard about him. I had kind of seen maybe a little bit of Love is the Message is Death, but I hadn't seen the whole movie. And I was completely blown away. Like so many people I know, I was just in awe of him. So when I watched that conversation between Tyler and Arthur, I thought, wow, I love this. I love the exchange that they're having. I feel like I'm right there. Yeah. So I started listening to more videos of Arthur, which opened me up to Saidiya Hartman and reintroduced me to Bell Hooks, who I hadn't really been, like, she hadn't been on my radar for a while, right? It's like, you know who she is, you've read her work, but like you're reading something else now, it's in the back burner. But that reintroduction to Bell Hooks and like the formal introduction to Saidiya Hartman, listening to Black academics and scholars talk about Black life, politics, identity, it turned on a light in me. Mm-hmm. And that light was, Sade, this is something you would love to do. You would love to sit across from a room, across from a table, and talk to someone who is knowledgeable about something you don't know, who has a unique perspective about something you don't know, who can teach you, who can enlighten you, who can inspire you. And so a culmination of all of those experiences over the course of the last 6 to 9 months is kind of what got me to where I am today in terms of podcasting, in terms of wanting to have conversations that, you know, I know people can listen to in their car on the way to work or wherever, you know, on the subway, going to see a friend. Things are different now, so maybe you're not on your way to work depending on what kind of work you do. But, you know, I thought, wow, this is a powerful way to connect with people, you know? And I just fell in love with it. I was like, I am so into this. I'm going to start my podcast. And it was a very simple, it was a simple decision. Yeah. And that was it.
Yeah. And which like, again, like the decision and the answer is always simple, but the work might not be. So could you talk maybe about the difficulties or the struggles that you had, and also the you know, triumphs, so the good stuff, but the experience of actually practically making a podcast, so getting guests on your show, marketing, audio editing, all that stuff, because I'm really interested in hearing more about that, because it's been an adventure with the Blue Record for sure.
Yeah, so as for me, I've been doing, it's like a one-stop shop. I do the podcast, I edit the audio, I've worked with, so like before the podcast started, I reached out to a friend of mine who's a producer, and I got some custom music made. So I have custom audio tracks that are just for me. And we've worked together on other projects before. So it was like pulling into my own network of people that I wanted to connect with and stay close to. And once I had that music that was kind of official, it kind of helped me to set the tone of like, okay, this is what I want the podcast to sound like. This is what I want it to feel like. But in terms of process, you know, it really starts with the person who's going to be on the episode at that episode. And what do I want to say? What do I want the audience to hear? Or like, just what do I want to be able to pull out of a person? And that requires a bit of research. So I start with a person, and then I go through a research period where I just look at stuff on Google. I find out as much about them as I can. I do my due diligence, and I also use information that's already out there. So if this artist is someone like Renee Cox, who has such an illustrious long career, then I don't want to ask questions that she's already answered. I would love to try to tailor my episode with her and our conversation around things that might be new and a little bit innovative in the sense that she hasn't touched on them before. And plus, we're in a new place, right? So the things that we'll talk about will be affected by COVID, will be affected by where we are in society and in the world at this period. So that's definitely the beginning of how my podcast starts. But as far as editing audio, I did quite a bit of research on my own. I used different programs like Audacity or Adobe Audition, and I'm completely self-taught. So between YouTube videos and, tutorials and reviews online, getting the equipment, going to like Guitar Center in New York City, picking out microphones, picking out an interface, and then recording at home as a test, as a trial. Those were all the things that I did to prepare and get ready to actually have an official episode. And yes, it wasn't so much that it was challenging, it's just that it's a learning curve, right? You take the time, you invest in learning it, and then you're like, okay, I'm gonna do this. And that was pretty much my experience. And then as far as marketing and social media, again, being able to connect with people and reach out to people and get, that email doesn't get lost in the cracks meant that I could share the podcast with more people, that I could do, partnerships and collaborations on the back end. So, it might not be well known, but I have like a partnership with Sugarcane Magazine, where every time a podcast episode comes out, they feature it on their newsletter. There are other magazines that I've done stuff like that with too. There's TSA Magazine, which is an online-based magazine. Nigeria, it's like based in Nigeria, but the woman who runs it also lives in Amsterdam. And we do a collaboration where certain episodes are featured on their newsletter. I've also reached out to another online platform called The Black School, and we're working on a few things together. So there are all of these new and interesting marketing opportunities that have come up where, we share content, right? I share content on my page about them. They share content on their page about me. And so it's a mutually beneficial relationship. And so as far as having like a very robust marketing program, that's expensive, right? And that takes a very big financial investment. And because people are sheltering in place at this time, I think, and holding on to what they have, holding on to their resources, I haven't built out a robust marketing program for the podcast yet, just because of where things are right now. It will take a little bit more time to get there. And I think in the process of getting there, I will have built up a body of work that is very extensive and has a really great roster of artists. And so that's something that I'm really, really excited about for sure.
Yeah, and I think that that's really attractive to new listeners. I always get so sad, like, when I discover a new Instagram page or a new YouTube channel or a new podcast that is really great. The idea is great, and I have like 2 episodes, and so it's like, oh no, I really wish that there was more, and then I have to wait. It's kind of like discovering a new series on Netflix and not being able to binge watch it.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So, oh gosh. Okay, so we're about the last 2 minutes of our talk, really the last 8, and I wanted to sort of wind down and open up the floor for questions. So if anybody in our audience, hello everyone, if anybody has any questions, you can just submit them on the Q&A feature. I think we actually have one already, and it's a really fun question. I'll answer it now. The question is, what podcast are you each listening to in your free time? So I think this is a very relevant question. Would you like to begin?
Yes, definitely. So I still listen to The Daily quite a lot. It's, one where I just kind of get a little bit of info about what's going on in the world. I listen to NPR quite often. And one of the newer podcasts that I'm really interested in is done by Dario, who shot Viola Davis for Vanity Fair. His podcast is called the Black Imagination Podcast. And I just love the things that he talks about. I also really love the way his podcast is produced. So for me, listening to podcasts is kind of like, it's less about the content. It's more about like learning and discovering how other people are producing and laying out their podcasts. So it's almost like research. And it's really interesting because that's kind of how I read today as well. I've talked to a lot of people about this, and it's like, how much time do you have to read for fun? And we're like, none. Like, we're really reading for life and we're reading for work, right? Like all of the stuff that I consume somehow filters back into like my work life, which is a really interesting concept. But yeah, so I listen to podcasts for like research.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I do as well. One that I always listen to is the Blue Record podcast.
Oh, nice. Yeah, I didn't mention that one. Yeah.
That's fine. So yeah, and I enjoy listening to the Blue Record. So although I'm on the team and I'm really privy to the topic, and I can very easily access the episode outline. Our podcast is also quite conversational, so there's always something there to discover, whether it's an inside joke that we share as team members or an anecdote that I wasn't aware of, and so I learned something new about one of my team members. It's a really beautiful experience, and our episodes are about an hour or so long. I like podcasts that are that long because I feel like they take up a good amount of time. But outside of the Blue Record and Lightworks, which I've just discovered it and really enjoy, I also listen to the Modern Art Notes podcast, which is a podcast that talks about modern art. It's sort of in a similar structure to your Sade, where there's an invitation of one, but sometimes two speakers, and there's some really electrifying interviews. Amy Sherwood was on there, and I adore her. Wow. Yeah, so they're really good. I also like to listen to podcasts that are associated with television that I'm watching. So I've been in love with Lovecraft Country, and so I listen to Lovecraft Country radio. And just two more. One is Black Girl in Om. It's a really great Om as in OM, and then also Coffee and Books. I just started that one yesterday, and it was really beautiful. So those are some that I listen to. In varying frequencies, but yeah, so that was that question, and we don't have any more, so if anybody does have a question, please do post it. But I also have one that I'd like to ask. I want to know more about sort of your process for initiating contact. How do you reach out to a potential collaborator, and do you have any strong do's or don'ts for doing that?
Yes. For me, one of the most important things is just being professional and following up with people in a really nice and generous and kind way. I find that when I'm honest and open, the feedback that I get is always really, really positive. I definitely have a little bit of a structure where I use like an email template. I type out an email template that I think really speaks to what I want to say, what I want to communicate, in as little words as possible. I understand that when you're new to someone, people's like threshold for like reading is actually really low, right? Yeah. If you're really, really busy and you have a lot on your plate, it may just take a while to get back in touch with people. And so I try to put as much information as I can in a very small, short, nice, tight email. I have a deck that I created with the help, like a friend of mine, me and a friend, his name is Charles Moore, and he recently just published a book called The Black Market, which is all about collecting art, and it's all about giving people information and tidbits. So it's interesting because it's like part interviews of other artists and conversations with artists, but it's also a how-to on collecting art, especially Black art, which I think is great. But so Charles was a person in my life who was like, Sade, you need a deck. So when it comes to outreach and reaching out to brands or even other artists who I want to have on the show, I always make sure to attach my deck, which has information, and it hits a few boxes. It's like, who are you? What do you do? Why do you do it? And like, what do you want to do with me? right? So the deck will talk about what I want to collaborate on or what I'm interested in doing with another person. It'll have a little bit of information about my background, where I went to school, what I'm passionate about. It'll have a little bit of information on my skill set, what I've accomplished in my career, what I have skills in and what I can do, and how I can bring those skills to bear working with you, right? Working with the person I want to collaborate with. That combination of my like template email and my deck have brought me much success in connecting with folks and just making that first connection. And, you know, it's interesting that you asked, because a lot of people have come back and said, thank you for your thoughtful and kind email. Thank you for sharing what you really want to do with me. Thank you for your kind words. And all of that goes a long way. It has to be genuine. You have to be generous in the way you connect with people. And I think it can't be about taking, it's about community building. And people can sense, excuse my French, but people can sense bullshit a mile away. If you're generous and genuine, people recognize that. So I found that, and it might sound kind of corny, but leading with love and leading with positive intention always works for me, always. Even if it takes us weeks or months to get back in touch, we do get back in touch.
Yeah, that is so beautiful and so poignant, I think, and a really lovely note to end today's conversation on.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for taking this time, for all of your insightful words and for your kindness.
Thank you.
This has been a really lovely conversation. I hope everybody watching now live enjoyed it, and I also hope everybody watching the rebroadcast enjoys it as well. Thank you again, everybody, for tuning in today.